we'll go in and we'll put solar on top of their building. So now, regardless of the business they're operating within the building, they're now also in the power company because they're generating their own power. And in doing so, it opens up about 4 or 5 different incentives that start with what's called the federal tax ID, the investment tax credit, the ITC, which is anywhere from 30 to 50% of the cost of the system. They can recoup dollar for dollar as a credit, not a deduction, on their taxes, which they can extend out over a 10-year period. That's the biggest bang for the buck, that federal tax credit. They also, as a clean energy producer, that are eligible for carbon credits. So that is a direct pay over a 5 or 7 year revenue stream because they're a clean energy producer.
Welcome to CREPN Radio for influential commercial real estate professionals who work with investors, buyers, and sellers of commercial real estate coast to coast. Whether you're an investor, broker, lender, property manager, attorney, or accountant, we're here to learn from the experts.
Welcome to Commercial Real Estate Pro Network's CREPN Radio. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jay Darren Gross. This is the podcast focused on commercial real estate investment and risk management strategies. Weekly, we have conversations with commercial real estate investors and professionals who provide their experience and insight to help you grow your real estate portfolio. Today's interview is sponsored by Building Insurance and Risk. When you invest in real estate, it pays to work with a real estate investor protection specialist to protect yourself and your investment from catastrophic loss. The experts at Building Insurance and Risk focus on real estate investor protection. They provide you with multiple insurance coverage offers and a side-by-side coverage comparison. To learn more, go to buildinginsurancerisk.com. Today, my guest is Carl Moose. Carl is a seasoned executive with nearly 30 years of experience spanning business development, mergers and acquisitions, real estate, and energy solutions. And in just a minute, we're going to speak with Carl Moose about how renewable energy can turn your property into a high-performing asset. But first, a quick reminder, if you like our show, CREPN Radio, there are a couple things you can do to help us out. You can like, share, and subscribe. And as always, we encourage you to leave a comment. We'd love to hear from our listeners. Also, if you want to see how handsome our guests are, be sure to check out our YouTube channel. You can find us on YouTube at Commercial Real Estate Pro Network. And while you're there, please subscribe. With that, I want to welcome my guest, Carl Moose. Welcome to CREPN Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm looking forward to our conversation. But before we get started, if you could take just a minute and share with the listeners a little bit about your background.
Yeah. So I started my commercial real estate career as a loan officer for ABN AMRO and some of the other larger banks here in Chicago. I was analyzing and financing buildings and eventually started buying them myself. So I put partnerships together. We bought about 22 apartment buildings over the course of roughly 5 or 6 years. And in that time, I also got into the renewable energy space by investing in a company that was a startup. Over the last couple of decades, my background is commercial banking, commercial real estate, and renewable energy. And so that's morphed into what we're doing now, which we're going to talk about in a little bit.
Cool. Well, to start with, maybe a good place to start might be just to define what are the renewable green energy options available.
Yeah, so most of what we do is solar related. We work with commercial. We also have a residential division, but I primarily run the commercial division where we work with owner-occupied, typically single-tenant property owners that are operating their business out of their building. And for most people, a building is a necessary evil. It's something that where they operate their business. So how can you increase the value of that, or what we call energize that? And so we've come up with what we call the energized real estate model, where we'll go in and we'll put solar on top of their building. So now, regardless of the business they're operating within the building, they're now also in the power company because they're generating their own power. And in doing so, it opens up about 4 or 5 different incentives that start with what's called the federal tax ID, the investment tax credit, the ITC, which is anywhere from 30 to 50% of the cost of the system. They can recoup dollar for dollar as a credit, not a deduction, on their taxes, which they can extend out over a 10-year period. That's the biggest bang for the buck, that federal tax credit. They also, as a clean energy producer, uh, that are eligible for carbon credits. So that is a direct pay over a 5 or 7 year revenue stream because they're a clean energy producer. There's also something called the MACRS, which is an accelerated depreciation. They can depreciate that system, the majority of that, in over a 5 year period. Oftentimes, they can also use what's called the 179 tax depreciation as well, to depreciate a big chunk of that in year one. So there's 4 or 5 different programs that we introduce to these property owners, that can really boost their bottom line by producing their own energy and taking advantage of all the federal, state, and utility incentives out there.
Yeah, no, I'm just looking at the numbers you were saying there, between the federal tax thing from 30 to 50%, and then to be able to accelerate the depreciation. Um, I mean, I'm just trying to think how many people say no when you talk with them.
Well, it's interesting you say that because when I talk to a business owner, I put on my real estate hat. How do you increase the value of a commercial property? You increase the NOI, right? And that means either you increase the income, decrease the expenses, or both. Well, in our scenario, we do both, right? Because one of the biggest variable costs for a business owner is their electric bill, and electric bills aren't going down; they continue to go up. So how do you take that variable monthly expense and fix it? It's just good common sense business. I don't care what business you're in. If you could take a variable expense and fix it, that's just good business. Why do airlines buy futures on fuel? Because they're hedging their bet. They know, if they buy a gallon of jet fuel and they buy futures on that, they're fixing that variable expense. It's just good business. The other thing I tell them is, how do you take your biggest liability, which is your roof, and it's the biggest system in your building is your roof. How do you take that liability and turn it into an asset? Unless you're the United Center or you're getting some big corporation to pay you for the roof, your roof is a liability. So how do you take that liability and turn it into an asset, right? And then the third thing is, how do you use federal, state, utility money to do that? So liabilities become assets, variable expenses become fixed, and you're using federal, state, utility money to pay for the majority of it. So I didn't say solar in any of that, right? It's not about solar. It's about, liabilities becoming assets, variable expenses becoming fixed using federal, state, utility money. So most business owners lean forward, right? And for us to do our assessment, it's a no cost, no obligation assessment. My team will come in and actually give you all the numbers so that you can see exactly what the benefits are.
So in a typical situation, is there a size of building you find that works best, or I mean a range?
Yeah, great question. So usually if you're 25,000 square foot or larger, the numbers start to work. Anything smaller than 25,000. Now, that's not to say that we would look at a 23,000 square foot building, but typically, a 25,000 square foot or larger is going to pencil out. Also, single tenant, because the way the programs are designed, the federal program goes with whoever owns the roof. All the other programs go with whoever pays the bill, right? So if you've got, multiple tenants, it starts to get a little tricky. If you have a building where you're not paying the electric bill, it gets a little tricky. So the lowest hanging fruit is really 25,000 square foot, a larger owner occupied business.
Got it. Does the owner of the building then own the equipment when it's installed?
Another great question. There's a couple of different ways to go with regard to that. The building that we're buying a 44,000 square foot building, and we're going to own the equipment. And the incentives go with whoever owns the equipment. So if you own the equipment, you get all the incentives. If you're allowing somebody else to put their solar panels on your roof, which oftentimes is the case, you get the benefit of a revenue stream, but you don't get the full impact of all the incentives. And the upside to that scenario where you don't own the equipment is you're not coming out of pocket. You're producing a revenue stream. The downside is you have somebody else's equipment on your roof. So I typically, in a commercial deal, just like the one we're buying, right, we're going to own the equipment because we get the full incentives for that. But there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat. And so, we have scenarios, if someone says, well, I like the idea, or they may have an ESG, environmental, social, and governance initiative, right? Like Target or Walmart, they're going solar primarily to satisfy their ESG, but they're not owning the equipment. Somebody else comes in and puts the equipment in and pays them for that space. So it really just depends on what the objectives of the business are.
Got it. And as far as the power generation, you talked about revenue. Is there a scenario, or is it common that the building owner receives any kind of a cash back, or from generating power, or credit to their electric bill, or how's that
Yeah.
work?
So I'll give you an example. The building we're buying, right? So we're going to buy this building, and the current seller, it's a sale lease back. So the current owner is going to sell it to us. We're going to lease it back to them, right? So they're going to pay us that monthly rent. We're also going to add about $100,000 to that building because we're producing their energy. So instead of them paying the power company, they're going to pay us for electricity. That's going to equal about $62,000 a year, and then we're going to get the carbon credits that are worth about $40,000 a year. So we're going to take a building that is going to produce about 300,000 in rental income. We're going to add another 100,000+ to the bottom line by going solar. We're also, that particular building also qualifies for a 40% federal tax credit. So we're going to put about $1 million system up there. We're going to get $400,000 back in a federal tax credit on top of the revenue from the power that we're producing, on top of the carbon credits that we're producing. We're also going to be able to accelerate the depreciation on that. So we'll be able to take 80% of that 1,800,000 and depreciate that over a 5-year period. In addition, you're ready for this? It happens to be in a zone where the U.S. Department of Agriculture, believe it or not, is going to give us a 50% grant. So 50% of the cost of the system we're going to get in a grant. So $500,000 we're getting back. That system is basically going to cost us nearly nothing after about a year and a half. And we're physically improving the building because we're also going to put a roof on it underneath the solar. And we're financially improving the building by about 33% in addition to the rental income. So this is when people really start to understand what the advantages are. It's pretty compelling.
No, sign me up. I'll take
Yeah.
two. Um, so on these systems, you mentioned the roof. They're typically attached to the roof, I assume.
Well, it's most of what we do is flat roof, so it's what's called a ballast system. It doesn't actually, there's no penetrations in the roof. It's literally just sits on top of the roof. Because a lot of people will say that. And by the way, my partner's a roofer, right? He has a roofing company. The roofers don't like people putting stuff on the roof or poking holes in the roof because obviously, if there's a problem, who are you going to call? You're going to call the roofer. In our case, my partner's also a roofer, so we've got that base covered. The point is, it just sits on top of the roof. So there's no penetrations as long as it's a flat roof. If it's a sloped roof like most people's homes, then you're going to actually attach it. Most of the commercial that we do are flat roofs.
Got it. So with respect to that, I typically think of a roof somewhere 20 to 30 years if you're lucky, as far as the life expectancy. How does that compare with life expectancy of the solar equipment?
Yeah, another great question. So when I talk about the technology, I like to just express that the solar technology is really driven by satellite technology. Satellites are powered by solar panels. So all the technology that goes into the solar system for a satellite is now trickling down to the rooftop. The panels we're installing today are the technology they were putting on satellites 5, 10 years ago, right? And think about it for a second. When it costs millions of dollars to put something in space, and those satellites are not up there for a year or two. They're up there for 20, 30 years, right? And so those solar panels are powering those satellites. So that technology is what's actually driving the solar panel technology. It's satellite technology. To answer your question, our panels will last 30 years. Plus, the warranty is 30 years. So just like your car, you might get a car, it's got a 10-year warranty. If you take care of the car, it's going to last more than 10 years. So the warranty on the panels is 30 years. It's going to last as long as your roof does.
Got it. And as far as the power generation, do people actually see, uh, I mean, is there cash back for the generation, or is it more of like a credit against their power bill? Because I'm
Yeah.
assuming you're still plugged into the grid.
Yeah.
You're not unplugging, right?
Another great question. Yeah, you're still on the grid, right? The grid acts as your battery. So if you're in a populated area like Chicago or the suburbs, you're going to be on the grid, right? And you're still going to have an electric bill for the connectivity and the meter. However, you're going to be producing your own energy. So what happens is the energy that you produce goes into your machinery or whatever your draw is or your load. Any excess power goes into the grid, and you get credit for that. So the power company typically is not going to pay you for that power, but they'll give you credit for that power. Now, a lot of people say, well, in Chicago, we've got November, December, January, February. Those are low production months, but the other 8 months are high production months. So over the course of the year, we have what's called net metering, right? What that means is that you can net out your meter. In other words, if you have enough square footage on your roof, you can actually produce on average what you use over the course of the year and zero out your meter so that the power company won't pay you, but they will give you credit. And typically that's the situation.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Is there a we talked about the size of the building, single tenant occupancy, usually best. Is there any other kind of list of questions that a prospective client should consider?
Yeah. So ownership of the building is important. I mean, most business owners that own their building are planning on being there for a while. So that's a key thing. The age of the roof is a key thing. And then also, it basically just boils down to how much energy you're consuming, and how much square footage you have up top on your roof. The general rule of thumb is every 100,000 square feet, which is what a roofer calls a square, will produce 1 kilowatt. So if you've got a 50,000 square foot facility, you could produce 50 50 kilowatts of power, which is quite a bit. So the math is pretty straightforward. It's just 2 + 2 = 4. So the question is, how long have you owned the building? How old's your roof? And how much energy you use? That's it. Going back to your point earlier, typically 25,000 square foot is the number where it really starts to make sense. Anything below that, a 10,000 square foot building, it's going to take you longer to pay off the system. So, we've done smaller systems, but typically at 25,000 square foot or larger. And by the way, the bigger the better. We've done projects 600,000 square feet. Those projects usually pay for themselves in 2 or 3 years, where the smaller projects just take a little bit longer to pay for themselves.
Got it. So the size of the building kind of shouts out to me either, large retail big box or some sort of a warehouse. Does it work as well in like manufacturing?
So the building, the main segment of our market is the light industrial manufacturing, because those are the people that typically own the building and they're using enough power, in their processes or their production where it makes sense. Retail strip centers, they can work, but typically you've got multiple tenants there. We've worked with retail property owners, so we can, it just gets a little trickier. It can be done, but the lowest hanging fruit is really light industrial manufacturing, food processing, warehouse, and logistics. Those are the ones that typically have a nice electric bill. They've got a nice sized building, and they feel the pain. I mean, every month they got to write that check for 7, 8, 9, 10,000. We've even seen electric bills as high as 50 or 60,000 a month. That's painful, right? And
Yeah.
they're escrowing their taxes every quarter, right? So they've got to pay their tax bill. And here's the other thing I say to people: when you pay your electric bill, there's no ROI in that. You get no return on that. And when you pay your taxes, there's no ROI, right? So when you invest in a solar project, now the money you put into that project, you're getting every month, you're getting an ROI because you're producing your own energy, and you're also getting those carbon credits. And instead of paying the federal government $1 million, you invest $1 million in the building, you're getting 30 to 40% back in a federal tax credit. So when you think of it from that perspective, people look at it and go, well, this makes sense.
Yeah. What about like these large data centers? Have you seen any interest from? I mean, those things are popping up all over the place, and doesn't look
Un,
like we're going to get rid of that. So,
Unbelievable. Well, no, and here's the statistics on data centers. They use 25% more energy per square foot than a typical commercial property. Here's why. Think about the data center. They have all these servers that are being run, and they're using energy. They're using electricity to run the data centers to do the computation. They're also generating heat. So now the data center has to put air conditioners in because your servers can't overheat. So you're drawing a ton of energy to run the computer system. Then you got to draw more energy to cool them down, right? So they typically use 25%, I'm sorry, 25 times the energy per square foot. The problem with the data centers is their roofs are often loaded up with RTUs, right? The refrigeration systems. If they have a field next to them, and a lot of them do because they're out in rural areas, now you can do a ground mount system and provide the power for the data center. So that's absolutely a market that we're looking into because they pay huge electric bills.
yeah. Now, I know out in Oregon, um, we have a bunch of, well, there's some cheap energy based on uh, the um, uh, the Columbia, the hydropower,
The hydro, yeah,
and and I know that's attracted a lot of um, the data centers because of that. I mean, it's been one of their primary uh, qualifiers as far as where can we get cheap power,
yeah.
kind of thing. So,
Well, you bring up a good point. So Illinois happens where we are, happens to be a great state, right? If you're paying less than about 12 cents a kilowatt hour, um, it becomes a little more difficult to make these systems pay for themselves over time. Places like Nevada, like where you have the big hydro, Tennessee, you get pretty inexpensive power there, right? So to put a solar system in, because remember, the energy's free, right? Solar energy is free. We get bombarded every day, every hour, every minute by solar energy. There's no lack of energy with regard to solar. The cost is capturing it and converting it, right? So if you're getting inexpensive energy from Hoover Dam or the Columbia, it takes a longer period of time for that capital investment to capture and convert the energy, the solar energy, to pay for itself. If you're in an area like us where you're paying 16, 17, 18 cents a kilowatt hour, it makes a lot more sense. So that's one of the dynamics. The other dynamic is whether the power companies renewable friendly. Here in Illinois, we've got Exelon, which is the company. They're very renewable friendly, right? We also have state programs that are very renewable friendly. So there's about 21 states in the union that solar really makes sense, and then the rest not so much for some of the variables I just spoke about. And one of the key things is how much you pay for energy, because if you're getting energy inexpensively, it doesn't make sense for the capital the capital expense to capture and convert solar energy.
so with that, let me ask you, because I also have some familiarity with Florida, and it seems to me that maybe it's changed here recently, but there was a time not too far back where Florida was, um, I don't know if they were regulating or they essentially are making it very difficult for you to put solar on your building because some sort of or I thought there was some sort of um, a legal hurdle, like the power companies owned the right to generate power. Um, is that does that make sense, or is that something I made up in my head?
Well, it's kind of counterintuitive, right? The Sunshine
Yeah,
State, right? You'd think
right, right,
Florida.
right,
So the funny part about it is Florida, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, they make it difficult for you to produce your own power. And we don't do any projects in those states, even though they have a lot of sunshine. But the state regulations, the way their power grid is set up, it's difficult to make solar work, especially in Florida. The problem you have in Arizona and New Mexico is they don't have a lot of precipitation and they have a lot of dust. So the dust will cover the panels and actually cause problems. And then the last thing is they overheat, believe it or not. Have you ever left your cell phone on your dashboard? It
yep,
overheats, right? Well, solar panels overheat. So when you're in those sunshine states, Florida, New Mexico, Texas, and by the way, Texas is an oil state. They don't want solar, right?
right.
And when you're down, but however, those states, at noon in the middle of July, when the sun is beaten down, the panels shut down. They actually overheat. So we don't have that problem up here because our ambient temperature is never such that you shut down the panels. Where in places like Florida Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Southern California. During the summer, where you have the most sun, the panels actually overheat. So that's why you don't see a lot going on down there.
Hmm. I always thought it was kind of odd that, like I said, the Sunshine State was, resistant to that.
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
but if that's the case, I mean, I could see that, making some sense. But so with that, is there any limitations, or are you guys nationwide, or how do you operate?
Yeah, so we're based in Chicago. My partner and I have been in business for decades. Illinois is a great state. Michigan's an okay state. Ohio's a good state. Believe it or not, Wisconsin, which is right above us, Indiana, which is to the east, and Iowa to the west, are not good states, primarily because of the way their power companies set up, and the state legislation. Right. So um, we've done projects in primarily Illinois, Michigan, Ohio. New York is a good state. Massachusetts is a good state. Both Carolinas are good states. They get good solar. They have a good solar resource. In other words, they get good energy production. But the power companies and the state legislation is conducive to renewable energy. So not every state is ideal for solar.
Is that a political hurdle? Is that anything you see any kind of potential movement on?
So also very interesting. I had breakfast with some of my colleagues today. The federal ITC is the big program, and that's not going anywhere. That's set in law till 2030. And by the way, that's not money set aside. It's a IRS code. Actually, it's code 45 and code 48. So there's not a pot of money that the government could turn the spigot off on it. It's a federal tax credit. So that's the big one. It's not going anywhere. The other one is the carbon credits. Those are not regulated by the government. It's actually a private enterprise in exchange. Basically, you produce credits and you sell them on the exchange, kind of like a Bitcoin or a bond. So there's a market for that that's not regulated by the federal government. So those programs aren't going anywhere. And then you trickle down to the state and the utility programs. And the reality is, back to your point about data centers, with AI coming online, we're using more and more power, right? So the grid is actually overburdened. How do the power companies deal with that? They incentivize people to go solar, right? So now our building is going to be, it's technically still connected to the grid, but we're going to be producing our own energy. So it's not a burden on the grid. And here's the kicker: the power company gets credit for our clean energy production, right? So they can actually meet their mandate by incentivizing us to go solar because we're producing energy quickly, and they get the benefit for that.
Wait a minute. The federal credit could benefit the power company, but in the states where they've set it up to where between the power and the legislature, they restrict the generation of power. I mean, for solar,
Well, they don't restrict it. The federal is the nationwide, so
right?
that's a federal program. The states regulate the power. So even though there's the national power authority, every state has their own. Like in Illinois, it's called the Illinois Power Authority. Well, there's one in New York and Oregon and everywhere else you go. It's regulated on the state level. Some states are more pro renewable than others, right? So the state programs vary state to state. The federal program is nationwide.
Got it. Got it. Well, as far as um, you know, or I guess the territory, it sounds like you find more success north of the more heated states, and then depending on the local laws, is that kind of the what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that has a lot to do with it. And if you think of where we are from a latitudinal way, from New York to San Francisco, if you just thought of a band across the states, those are really good states. Again, because they have good solar resource and they don't have the overheating problem, and most of them have good precipitation, which helps to you know wash
Keep
any
them clean.
dust
Yeah.
off the panels. And then it boils down to what's going on in each of those states. So Northern Illinois, believe it or not, is one of the best states, probably top 5 states for solar. And it just so happens that's where we're located. So most of our business is in Northern Illinois.
Well, it's cool. I can remember as a kid learning about solar and thinking like, God, what a simple solution. Why isn't everything solar? And you know, since that time, I mean, I don't know how many generations of solar panels have been created, but I'm assuming that they're a lot more efficient today than what I can remember the model we looked at, probably 40, 50 years ago was kind of more like an experimental uh, thing. I remember like little electronics where we'd play with like a little solar panel or like a solar computer, or not a computer,
Yeah,
but a calculator, kind of
yeah.
thing.
Well, it's yeah, absolutely, 100%. We're on about number six generation, right? And so solar panels been around for a long time. As I mentioned, what's really driving the technology is satellite technology. 10 years ago, there were about 1,000 satellites up in space. Now there's over 10,000. I mean, literally everything we
Yeah,
do, including this phone call, is being
right.
driven by satellites. So that's what's driving the technology. Um, and they're pretty basic. I mean, it's just material science, right? I mean, it's just two plate pieces of glass and the alternating beds of material where it's the ultraviolet light. It's not the visible light. It's the ultraviolet light that knocks the electron off one layer and passes on to the next one to create a current, right? So the technology itself is pretty basic. But here's the kicker. I have a degree in geology, right? I studied geology. Why are we digging up 600 million year old plants and animals that derive their energy from the sun? The same sun that's shining on you and I is the same sun they used 600 million years ago to grow and the plants grew and the animals ate the plants and they all died. They got compressed and now they're hydrocarbons, coal and natural gas and oil, right? Why are we digging those 600 million year old plants and animals up to put them on a train to transport them 100 miles away to process them to burn them to create energy to create steam to turn a turbine that's on a generator and then send that power all the way back to where we use it when we can produce energy right where we consume it. So from that perspective, it makes total sense. Become a producer of energy instead of consumer of energy. The kicker is you got to capitalize that, right? As I mentioned before, the energy source is free. And by the way, if the sunlight always stops, we got really big problems, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So the sun's going to rise tomorrow. If not, we got big problems. But it's the capitalization, and they've driven the cost down, and they've provided incentives so that now it makes sense.
yeah. No, I was gonna say the answer I know is not political. It's capital. There's people that have invested a lot in the system that we have, and they don't want to lose, and so they're going to do everything they can to protect their position.
Yeah.
And
Well, think of Mhm. Yeah, I
no,
always
but
like to think of energy. There's three. You produce the energy, you transmit the energy, and then you distribute the energy. That's from the power utility company. And then you think about macro, micro, right? The city of Chicago is never going to go off the grid. It's just not. It's just that's macro. It's big, right? So the energy companies they realize that even no matter what they say in the press and everything else, their business is healthy and it's not going anywhere, right? We are on the micro level, right? So whether it's your home or a 25,000 square foot business, that's micro to the grid, and it doesn't even register for them, right? And so solar's never going to put ComEd or Exelon or any of these power companies out of business because they're always going to have the macro users. Period. End of story. As far as the oil, you know, I think it's less than 10% of a barrel of oil is actually used for energy. Most of it's for pharmaceuticals, for plastics, for cosmetics, for paints and everything else. So, the oil business isn't going to be impacted by this either, regardless of what you hear in the news. Very small percentage of a barrel of oil today is used for energy production. So they're
right,
not worried about, whether I go solar or not. As a matter of fact, they're incentivizing us to do it because it helps them out with their mandates.
yeah, a good point. Hey, Carl, if we could, I'd like to shift gears here for a second. As I mentioned to you before we started, by day I'm an insurance broker, and as such, I work with my clients to assess risk and determine what to do with the risk. And there's three strategies we typically consider. We first look to see if there's a way we can avoid the risk. If that's not an option, we look to see if there's a way we can minimize the risk. And if we cannot avoid nor minimize the risk, we look to see if we can transfer the risk. And that's what an insurance policy is. It's a risk transfer vehicle. And as such, I like to ask my guests if they can look at their own situation. It could be your clients, um, political, um, environmental, whatever it is that you identify and consider to be the biggest risk. And again, for clarification, while I'm an insurance broker, I'm not necessarily looking for an insurance related answer. And so, if you're willing, I'd like to ask you, Carl Moose, what is the biggest risk?
Yeah. So, as a property owner, and when I'm dealing with property owners, anytime you make a change to the building or you install something on the building, like solar, there's some risk there. I mean, obviously their first concern is, are you going to poke holes in my roof, and is my roof going to leak? So that's one of the considerations. The other is, weather. They ask, well, are these going to blow off if we get a big weather storm, or is hail going to damage these? And the answer is possibly. If the storm is big enough and if the hail is big enough, you have that risk. And then, of course, they ask about, are they going to work, right? And so there's enough data out there with regard to whether the solar panels are going to work, and we know the sun's going to be there, right? So that's not an issue. The question then becomes, are these things actually going to work? And there's enough data out there to support, our response to that. Which, yeah, they're going to, the way that we install them, the way that they're designed, they will perform. So those are the questions that we get from business owners, with regard to, if I make this change and go ahead and put solar panels up there, those are typically their concerns.
Got it. Hey, Carl, where can the listeners go if they'd like to learn more or connect with you?
Yeah, so a couple things. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with them. If they want to give me a call, I can be reached at 630-785-0031. Again, 630-785-0031. Our website is greenlightenergy.solar, not .com, .solar. So greenlightenergy.solar. And then, of course, my email is Carl, CARL, at greenlightenergy.solar. And again, regardless of what state you're in, we this is our subject matter, and we're experts in it. So regardless of what state you're in, we'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you. That's what we do all day, every day. If you happen to be in Illinois, we perform a no cost, no obligation assessment to actually give you the numbers. And by the way, we are also certified and registered with the Illinois Power Authority, the U.S. Power Authorities, and the utility companies. So the data we provide is regulated, and it's accurate to their standards.
Well, Carl Moose, I can't say thanks enough for taking the time to talk. I've enjoyed it, learned a lot, and look forward to doing it again soon.
I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. For our listeners, if you like this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Remember, the more you know, the more you grow. That's all we've got this week. Until next time, thanks for listening to Commercial Real Estate Pro Network's CREPN Radio.
You're listening to CREPN Radio for influential commercial real estate professionals. For more information on this or any of our guests, like us on Facebook, CREPN Radio.